According to the IPCC, Other Scientific Synthesis, and as laid out in Part 1, climate change has affected and is affecting Indigenous peoples first. The issues being faced by communities are compounded by the changing climate, alongside unforeseen consequences and intersectional problems. The challenges faced by Indigenous communities are continually being framed from a non-Indigenous perspective, making it hard to see the interdependent changes. At the present, the current impacts being experienced by tribal nations are far-ranging, and as we've learned, cannot be separated from colonialism, industrialization, and capitalism. To begin thinking about the issues, here are 6 Indigenous community health indicators used as a template by the Coast Salish Indigenous communities: community connection, natural resource security, cultural use, education, self-determination, and resilience. Public health complications include losing traditional food and medicine, infectious disease spread, the contamination of water and food sources, heat-related illnesses, extreme weather, and air quality. Historical grief and trauma are worsened by climate change, as well as structural issues rooted in poverty, inequality, and discrimination. In terms of mental health, the intensity of climate change has been associated with higher rates of mood and anxiety disorders, strong emotional responses, and loss of connections to homeland and social networks. Indigenous youth are especially present among those suffering from climate change-related mental health issues, and it's necessary to balance a discussion of the major problems of climate change with the work people are doing to remedy them. And simply reading the broad range of issues is difficult to put into context without seeing the people and communities being affected. So here are 9 case studies from tribal nations with their associated climate change adaptation planning. Climate change is one of the major concerns among Arctic Alaskan residents. It challenges the indigenous peoples who live there by altering their ancestral territory, hindering access to animals, and influencing physical and spiritual well-being. A big issue communities are facing are due to the rising sea temperatures. Near the coastal areas where Inupiat communities are, the ocean environment is getting too warm for the bowhead whale to survive, a cultural-centered species. One of the ways this affects communities is now Inupiat whalers have to go out 50 miles into open waters, requiring them to use motorized boats and other technology. The Inupiat communities also use whale hide for drums, so if there is no whale, there is no music and no celebration. In turn, plastic is used in place of whale. Yet it is through facing these challenges that Inupiat communities actually reinforce their cultural relationship with the bowhead whale to better cope with an unpredictable environment and future. What this tells us is that when faced with environmental uncertainty, vulnerable populations reaffirm their cultural identities and traditions. Because at the same time as Inupiat villages are looking for whales, whales are looking for the villages with the good music. The Tlingit and Haida people in southern Alaska have created a climate change adaptation plan that documents the changing conditions in their region, which include the changing precipitation patterns, more rain and less snow, as well as the changing ocean, which is becoming more acidified and warm. The plan also prioritizes the culturally important species from their adaptive capacity and sensitivity. The species that are at a very high priority of concern are salmon, shellfish, and cedar, due to their cultural, social, and economic value and the limited tribal control over their adaptive capacity. Salmon is an iconic cultural resource for the tribes. Traditionally, salmon provided the foundation for almost all aspects of cultural life for the Tlingit and Haida people and was an important trade good. Accessing the salmon and salmon fishing are vital to the health and well-being of tribal members and provide economic activity. The climatic and environmental stressors have combined to place salmon populations at an all-time low for the Tlingit and Haida and other tribes. As for resiliency strategies, they will continue to work in collaboration with the diverse group of stakeholders to restore stream habitats, ensure sustainable harvesting of existing stocks, and enhance the ability of salmon to reach their spawning grounds. For each species at risk, there are these actions to increase resilience. The Kanien'kehá:ka people of the Flint, or Mohawks in English, is one of the 6 nations within the Iroquois Confederacy. In their climate adaptation plan, it gives an introduction to climate change and lists the harmful effects relevant to tribal communities, but also the potential of a changing climate to create beneficial opportunities. The three sisters, corn bean and squash, are foundational to the tribal members' survival. Climate change and industrialization in recent years has negatively impacted the three sisters from contamination and changing precipitation patterns. Part of the ongoing plan to address this issue is seed storage and exchange in the form of a community seed bank. Along with the three sisters, the other sections include parts of their creation stories, such as the star's role in climate change, Grandmother Moon, the grandfathers or thunder beings, as well as the creator himself, which poses that adaptive approaches to research management and education ensure the tribe's traditional cultural practices continuation into the future. At the end of the document it reads, "We have now arrived at the place where we end our words. Of all the things we have named, it was not our intention to leave anything out. If something was forgotten, we leave it to each individual to send such greetings and thanks in their own way. And now, our minds are one." For the Ojibwe's 1855 ceded territory of 6.4 million acres in Minnesota, the Bois Forte Band, Fond du Lac Band, and Grand Portage Band created a climate change adaptation plan. In the document, there is also an adaptive capacity and sensitivity chart, just like the Tlingit and Haida communities. A few of the most vulnerable and key focus areas are paper birch, wild rice, moose, and water quality and quantity. The Ojibwe people have a special cultural and spiritual tie to wild rice, or manuman. There are non-climactic stressors that are negatively affecting wild rice, and climate change will increase these as well as bring new stressors. This is just an example of one of the aspects of Ojibwe culture being affected by climate change, and it is difficult to translate how important wild rice is to the Ojibwe culture. That losing the ability to cultivate it would not just harm the physical health of an Ojibwe member, but this has mental, spiritual, and sociological ramifications. In the end of the plan, they list that preparing for climate change is a process, not an outcome, and that success depends on whether the strategies are implemented to their fullest potential, and that there is an iterative process to frequently revisit it. The Ojibwe tribe also created a tribal adaptation menu, which is a living document that invites each user to add language, words, concepts, strategies, approaches, and tactics to customize the menu to fit their community. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes include the Salish, Kootenai, and Pendorales tribes. Today, the Flathead Reservation is 1.3 million acres, of which just over 790,000 acres are owned and managed by the tribes and its members. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes' climate change strategic plans, mitigation, and adaptation strategies are guided by local impact assessments, and overall, this plan represents an ongoing and evolving adaptive management process. The three tribes are culturally unique with their own belief system, yet are similar with at least these two foundational understandings. The first is that each holds knowledge of the natural environment. The second is that each has a profound respect for all of creation. Both of these traits have enabled the tribes to survive for thousands of years. The plan, along with the impacts of climate change to the tribe's valuable resources, also include tribal elder observations, who hold observational data spanning back 150 to 250 years through their lineages. One member, Stephen Small Salmon, says, "I remember Uncle Pete Beaverhead, and I used to hear him talking. They say it's going to be changing, just like our language, our life, the snowpack. It seemed like they knew. I don't know how they knew. I guess they were wise. Maybe they learned it from their folks, handed it down generation to generation, then to me. I started to realize it. The climate is changing. The life is changing. The world is changing. Everything is changing." The Swinomish Indian Reservation is located on Fidalgo Island in western Washington. When established, brought together several Coast Salish groups who share a culture around fishing and a ceremonial calendar revolving around cedar longhouses. With the community on the coast, they are subject to the dual climate change effects of sea level rise and face wildfire risk in their upper lands as well. The Swinomish Indian tribal community worked on a 2-year climate change initiative to study the impacts of climate change and develop recommendations on actions to adapt to projected impacts, which led to the creation of this plan. Within the document, there is a section on cultural traditions and community health, a climate change adaptation strategy toolbox, action recommendations and priorities, and action plan implementation. The implementation section has outlined what many, tribal and non tribal alike, struggle with when it comes to climate change plans: relevance to everyday life, forming regional partnerships, taking the incremental approach, and having flexibility in approaches are practical implementation tips. At the end of the plan, there are summaries from Swinomish community members. One says, "I would hope that this country's recognition of climate change is a very dangerous threat to humanity, that we will take this seriously, and that they will include the tribes as we go about trying to overcome that, and change the way that we live to protect our environment, and that we become partners to overcome this threat, this crisis." The Karuk tribe, located in Northern California, has made a climate assessment, a traditional ecological knowledge and knowledge sovereignty, as well as a climate adaptation plan. Their climate adaptation plan has an introduction that describes climate change as a strategic opportunity for tribal and non-tribal peoples around the world engaged in efforts to halt fossil fuel production, move to renewable energy and transportation systems, document the current impacts from climate change, and plan for the future. The Karuk tribe is leading the way in reestablishing traditional fire regimes, as fire has long been an important tool to change the land for cultural sustenance and well-being. Fire is especially critical for restoring grasslands for elk, managing for food sources including Tianoc mushrooms and black oak acorns, maintaining quality basketry materials, producing smoke that shades the river for fish, and more. Laws made in the early 1900s made cultural uses of fire essentially illegal, and as less burns happened, more vegetation grew. In addition to climate change bringing warmer temperatures and droughts, California faces catastrophic fires every year. We need to get back onto the landscape and learn what is going on. And looking at this trajectory, TEK indicates we could find ourselves in an opposite situation. Relearning from our ceremonies and revitalizing Karuk practices and belief systems should lead us to solutions regardless of the particular way the climate is going. People need to be noticing these things for themselves. This is how we teach and learn in Karuk culture. It is based on observation and practice. The Navajo Nation is located on the four corners of the Colorado Plateau, which extends into Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. There are over 300,000 enrolled tribal members, and around half live on the reservation. With the majority of the Navajo Nation still practicing traditional dances, ceremonies, and other culturally sensitive events, it becomes hard to implement new strategies that do not go against what many Navajos were taught and continue to live by. At the same time, many tribal members are concerned about losing these traditional practices due to climate stress. For example, within the culture, horses are considered to be powerful and sacred beings, which make it difficult to resolve the overpopulation of feral horses present in Navajo Nation. Feral horses top the priority lists of the climate adaptation plan due to damage to natural resources they are causing and grazing management knowledge being lost as there is a lack of transfer between old and new livestock owners. In response to these issues, the plan reiterates the need for traditional knowledge to be adopted within policy plans and management. The Isle de Jean Charles is a very small ridge of land located in southern Louisiana. For over 170 years, it has been the historical homeland and burial grounds of the Isle de Jean Charles Band of Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw Indians. In 1955, the island was over 22,000 acres and has since lost 98% of its land. The tribe's ancestors moved to the island to escape the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears. Land loss is attributed to offshore drilling projects and dredging activities since the 1940s, dams and oil pipelines, and hurricane after hurricane. Tribal members who could afford to have been moving off the island, and in the early 2000s, only 25 families remained. In 2016, after nearly 2 decades, the tribe has finally received federal funding for resettlement to safer grounds. For tribal members, resettlement is seen as the best way to reunite displaced tribal members and rekindle traditional life ways. Being able to provide safe and sustainable housing, networks of care, a community center, museum, oral teaching educational spaces, library, seed-saving program, traditional plant gardens, and market combine together to provide a model to other tribes who will need to seek resettlement as a result of climate change.